Hello and welcome to another special Unsourced Wall review. Today we're taking a look at the brand new Elvis Presley biopic, Elvis, directed by Luhrmann and starring Austin Butler as Elvis Presley and Tom Hanks as Colonel Tom Parker. This film focuses on their relationship between the singer and his manager and the growing conflict that consumes both men as Elvis Presley's fame and fortune grows. And this is a really fun film. I think it's really good for what it tries to do. But first, I want to address some of the stuff that has become controversial around the film. Mostly things that kind of plague every single biopic, or at least a lot of them, which is that there are a lot of biopics out there, especially ones where the family or the estate of the subject person is involved in production, or at least has contract production, where they whitewash a lot of things and they sand off a lot of the edges. And that's definitely the case here. There's a lot of unsavory and lascivious stuff in Elvis's life that this movie either barely notes or just doesn't approach at all. And I think that's a shame, because like a lot of that stuff that his close friends or his business partners have alleged or claimed would have been like amazing to see in a really kind of dramatic film. That said, that's not what this movie is attempting to be. So while that would have been really awesome and I think really interesting and just really sort of cinematic, or at least like engaging character-wise in a really in-depth and analytical and complex biopic, that's not what Baz Luhrmann is trying to do here. And that's a shame on one hand, but I do really dig what he ended up doing. And another thing that this movie's been controversial about is, Elvis's background in, whitewashing himself, taking popular songs and songs written by black artists and black musicians and sort of like putting his name and label on it, and it's selling more because of how prioritized white musicians and white rock and roll stars are in that area. And so the movie attempts to sort of pave over these issues by having Elvis involved, or at least sort of like ruminating on and just being like kind of enthralled and being interested and engaged with the civil rights movement. And so there's no actual textual evidence that ever happened, so it comes off as kind of pandering and very condescending in places, especially if you're really interested and you're really sort of engaged with that area of history. To see that play out here, it's a little bit laughable. But again, a totally valid complaint. But I feel like this movie is so effectively done for what it wants to be, and for what its MO is, and for what its whole intent is, that as a film I really enjoy it. But I had to address these because otherwise it would feel unfair to the people that have those issues close to heart. But moving along, what Baz Luhrmann makes this film, and what I thought was a really interesting conceit when the first trailer came out, that I thought would just be like a little aside in the film properly, is actually the core of the film, which is that basically Baz Luhrmann has made his own Citizen Kane, where instead of Rosebud being this whole kind of like a symbol of innocence, a symbol of childhood, a symbol of simplicity for Charles Foster Kane, being in the form of his childhood, snow sled, it's instead Captain Marvel Jr., Shazam Jr., whatever you want to call him, the classic Golden Age superhero and current property of DC Comics, that forms Elvis's like symbol of what he wanted his life to be, and just like the touch point for how the movie kind of unravels his fall from grace. Because this is a depressing movie. This is a bittersweet movie. This movie is a tragedy in so many ways. So what Baz Luhrmann does is that he takes the Captain Marvel mythos, the Captain Marvel Jr. character and lore, and combines that with elements of a classic mythical tragedy, something like Faust, where you have Elvis, who was directly, overtly, paralleled in the text. There's dialogue about this. There's visual language applied to this. With Captain Marvel Jr., with Tom Hanks as Colonel Tom Parker, cast as this satanic, evil Wizard Shazam, who Elvis sells his soul to, basically, for fame and for fortune. And it's it's so incredibly well done, no less in part due to the actors' performances at selling this. Tom Hanks is this incredibly engaging and entertaining villain. And that, like, he is a villain through and through. There are no parts where you're meant to sympathize or understand or empathize with Colonel Tom Parker. He is this manipulative, scheming, like just demonically soul-suppressing figure in Elvis's life in this film. And Austin Butler has this classic kind of rise and fall. You see there are parts where he could have learned a lesson, where he could have taken a corner, but he keeps being dragged down by Colonel Tom Parker's machinations and his own desire to continue this lifestyle, both in part due to his own sort of hubris and his own fears of what he's leaving behind. It's very much like a Citizen Kane style story mixed with classic elements of, like, you know, deals with devils, you know, and it's portrayed pitch perfectly. I think that's what really works with this movie. That entire emotional through line. Austin Butler gives this powerhouse performance as like this conflicted but not so completely guiltless character, or you understand where he's coming from, where you understand his actions, and there are some that can be excused and there's some that just can't be. But through this performance, through this kind of body language that Austin Butler gives Presley, it's never far from being pitiable, and at most just incredibly heartbreaking. This is a heartbreaking film. This is a depressing film. A lot of the time, especially in the third act, where like a lot of the stuff that Parker has done to sort of derail and to maintain a strict grip of control over Presley's life come to a head, and Presley begins to realize kind of the folly of all of his actions and just like what he could have done that he just sort of misunderstood or let slip by in terms of opportunity for his own like free will agency, just start to like kind of bear down on him. I got a tear or two. Butler is incredible. If he quit acting right now, he would have gone out on a high note. And the film itself, well, that's where we have to sort of kind of reel back in a lot of this praise. It is a very chaotic, a very frantic, and a almost incoherent film. It's not a story per se. The framing device of the film is Colonel Parker, like in a coma, I believe. At the beginning of the film, he has a sort of medical emergency, and he's sort of like in this mindscape of like this endless like casino hall, sort of going through his memories of his time with Elvis Presley as his manager. And so the film is less of a coherent narrative of Presley's life or his career even, and more just snapshots of various eras of his life as sort of pinpointed specifically by Parker. And I think that works because with Elvis Presley, there is so much you could talk about, even in just his sort of career as like being this kind of iconic figure where there are so many different places his career went or didn't go, that you could, you know, feasibly touch upon and make an entire movie about. So this film tries to get in as much as it can. Now, for like the first third to first half, that doesn't really work. It creates this really sort of jumbled mess of tone and pacing, where you have like, oh, here's his first concert, here's his first recording session, here's his first meeting with Tom Parker. And these aren't like played as scenes that carry on through to another, but like I said, snapshots or vignettes. We're like, this is that snapshot, and we're moving on to this snapshot. Now, it's not like messily done. If I want to use the word vignette as well, because these are very intentionally done like as small little blocks, and I think that isn't until like the second half where this becomes a lot more clear, because then you have like moments where the movie stops to commentate and talk about like his early Vegas era and his sort of military career and his Hollywood era, which are all done in different styles, and it's incredible, and it's one of the highlights of the movie where you get these transitions. I just wish that the first half had more of that, even though they are doing the same things. The second half of the film does that more effectively, more detainingly, and more engagingly, especially again near the end, where everything comes to a head and the movie takes a really depressing and bitter and sorrowful turn. Like, that's when like you get that great amount of contrast, and everything is just sort of laid bare, which for a movie that is really stylized, which puts a lot of emphasis on aesthetics, is a really incredible move. and I think it handles the transition insanely well. But yeah, it is a long movie. It's like 2.5 hours, and it does feel it at times. Now, one thing I didn't quite like is that for a movie about music, the first half of the film doesn't really use much music of the era. It feels like the direction of the music was at odds in this film, where the first half tries to like classic sort of Elvis era music and the music that had inspired him, but then it also sprinkles in a few kind of contemporary music choices, as if this was like, The Great Gatsby or A Knight's Tale, where like, oh, see, we're doing this thing where we're going to use contemporary music to like set the tone of what that era was like. But it just kind of janks a bit because we're also using action music that was there at the time. So like you're going from a classic pop hit to like modern day a rap, and it's a weird and awkward juxtaposition. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I thought this was a great film, especially in terms of like what it does with the superhero element. Like I didn't expect it to go that hard, but yeah, it's done so well. It's done so often, and it creates this insane through line. Especially if you're a really big fan of Captain Marvel comics, of Shazam comics, and I've always been sort of like charmed, or at least really interested, or thought it was funny that Elvis, based a lot of his personality, a lot of his sort of show figurehood on Captain Marvel Jr., which has always been this kind of pop cultural anecdote. But to see an entire movie specifically use that as the foundational like text is so insane. And there are like so many little things that just sort of are both sprinkled in and made like root scenes for character development that spring forward from Captain Marvel Jr. that I don't know, like there are other Elvis biopics, other documentaries about Elvis, books written about Elvis that are probably more accurate, more engaging, and like probably a lot more interesting. But I don't know if there's gonna be anything that uses this like small point about Elvis, like that he was a huge mega nerd fanboy about Captain Marvel Jr. to this extent. And I think that's really a benefit and the most advantage you could have taken from this being a WB production, because WB owns DC Comics, which owns Shazam, which owns Captain Marvel, and I don't think that you could have done this any other way if you didn't have that behind you. Like you would have had a Captain Marvel Jr. shaped hole in the narrative, and it's impossible to imagine this film without it because it makes it such a point, especially like this big sort of villainous monologue that Tom Hanks has, where he just sort of like lays it bare, like, yeah, no, this isn't like your comic book superheroes, The real world is more complicated. Truly heartening and depressing and tragic. And the more I think about this movie, the more I like it. I probably won't watch it for a while. It is a lot. Like I said, a lot of times people are going out on social media right now and sharing scenes, and I can't fault any of them because I feel like the moment this movie comes out on VOD or like on digital, people are going to be sharing like screen caps, clips. It's going to be insane because this movie is insane. There's so many things about this that are just so random and ridiculous that just can't help but be memeable. But there is a heart to this movie. And Austin Butler and Tom Hanks, they make that heart work for as much as it can and for as well as they can. And they're both stellar performers. So yeah, I wish that this movie was a little more interesting when it came to Elvis as a character. But it's more about like the myth around Elvis, more about his legacy, and more about like the various career turns that he made throughout his life. Which makes sense because, like I said, it's told through Parker's POV, and so this is what he frames Elvis through. Because he didn't care about Elvis the person, he cared about Elvis the merchandising opportunity. So we're seeing it through like all these different aspects of like how marketable and how sellable he was, which is great, which is a really fun character point. And the fact that Austin Butler makes it work as well as he can through that lens is just an even further testament to his talent, So yeah, I gotta give it, as like a biopic, as like an actual sort of character piece based on Elvis, I gotta give it a 6 out of 10. But as a Captain Marvel fan, as a superhero fan, as a fan of like tragedy and just on these performances, it might be more like an 8 or 9 out of 10. It is just that like interesting on that level. But either or, man, like if someone didn't like the movie, I wouldn't begrudge them. But I just had to say, like, The Rock and Black Adam have like an uphill battle because like there's two big Captain Marvel Shazam movies out this year, and this unfortunately just happens to be one. And Black Adam has some stiff competition if it wants to beat this. 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs middle, depending on where you're coming from this. But hopefully whoever watches the film enjoys it. If you've seen the film or plan on seeing the film, let me know below. Comment, subscribe, and leave a like, and let's get a conversation going. Are you a fan of like Elvis? Do you think this movie looks like a good representation of him? Are you not a fan of Elvis and you think the movie looks like a terrible representation of what he actually was like? And does the comic book connection, the fact that this is a superhero movie mixed with Faustian elements, make that assessment any different for either of you, whoever is watching this? But yeah, leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you have a great week and see you again next time.